mean, knowing what you want on a record is something that you develop. Like in any profession, you learn that part of the craft as you go along. And the same goes for me as the producer, of course. I mean, when we started working in here together, we were both as green as the grass, you know, and we both knew that we wanted the music to end up on the record sounding as close to the feeling we got on stage or the feeling that we got when we first heard the song or whatever is possible. But we did a lot of experimenting in those early days with embellishment of the music. I mean, some of those early records, we had strings and horns and all kinds of things on them. Some of those recordings we agreed were disasters. Some of them we agreed were very good, or even we might call them successful, you know. But it was all experimentation at that time. When we came around to do the first album, at that point in time, Stan was writing closer to the folk root than he was in the early days. And the decision was, of course, to do the record in that spirit as much as possible. And it was only until we got around to the last album, From Fresh Water, that we decided to go back and explore those early orchestral approaches that we had done in the early 70s.
So would you characterize, aside from being experimental, actually you working with Stan and the other musicians, was that clearly, I mean, you were of like mind on that? You wouldn't have conflicts generally when it came to decisions on production or a sound or a particular orchestration?
By the time we got into the studio, Stan and I generally would have agreed on the approach. Of course, once you get into the studio, there's fine-tuning that goes on in terms of the arrangement and, you know, who plays when is that guitar going to kick in and all of that kind of stuff. But before we go into the studio, we would have lots of meetings, conversations, jam sessions, whatever, deciding on the general feel of the thing. You know, the more we worked together, the more both of us got a sense of what that final sound would be in our heads. And Stan, I would say, even stronger than me. And the further we went along, it was Stan who was really calling the shots, you know, in terms of how the final product would sound. And we would sometimes get into some debates about that, for sure. But I always felt that it was Stan's vision that counted in the whole thing, and we generally went in that direction.
What was he like to work with?
Well, in the studio, pure pleasure. Pure pleasure because he was a professional, you know. One of the most frustrating things that can happen in a studio is when people aren't focused and aren't concentrating. And Stan had this switch in his head, you know, that he could just turn on the concentration. And there was no mussing around, no fooling around. We're here to do a job, let's do it. And yet, when the switch went off, or went on rather, he was the pure professional, but the feeling that came out of the guy's mouth, amazing, you know. I guess it comes into clearest focus when I think about doing the vocal overdubs, because we generally record the band tracks first, and then it would be Stan and me and the engineer and maybe Garnet and one or two others hanging around. And Stan would be in the studio all alone with his headphones, and we'd play the track, and he would sing the vocal. And I guess it was just a number of years we worked together. Generally, with a singer, I would be reticent to cut the singer off if I heard a mistake. If I heard a note that's out of tune or something, I'd be reticent to stop the tape and cut the singer off because I'd be afraid of destroying the mood. Didn't happen with Stan. I mean, you could stop the tape right in the middle of a line, and I would just get on the talk back and say, flat, and he'd say, right, roll tape, maybe roll it back, and start again, punch him in, and off we'd go. And you hear the feeling on the record, but if you were ever here seeing it go down, you wouldn't understand how he could possibly deliver that feeling. But he did, the professional.
Great. I remember when we talked once, some time ago, you talked not only about his being professional, but also about how he could. I think he put. I mean, you decided on a new song. I think was it in Northwest Passage or not sure which album it was, but he you replaced the song that you
Oh,
thought
yeah.
was going to be. Was it Turnaround? I'm not sure.
No, it's From Fresh
That's
Water.
Orange, that's
Yeah.
right. From Fresh Water. Yeah.
Actually, there's a interesting story. It was an incredible experience. We were here in this control room doing some keyboard overdubs on Flying, which is a kind of semi rock and roll song about hockey. So it's a bit of a loud and boisterous thing. And the engineer David Dobbs and I were sitting at the console, and Ray Parker, the keyboard player, was back there laying down this hot track, right? And Stan was over by the window. There was a table and a chair there, and he was writing on a piece of paper. So when we had finished overdubbing these keyboards, I went over and said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, I just wrote a new song." And I said, "Here, amid the din, you wrote a new song?" He said, "Yeah, and it's really good too." I said, "Well, that's great. What do you want to do with it?" And he says, "Well, I don't like this song, The Puddler's Tale, that we did. I want to replace it with this one." So I said, "Okay, when do you want to do it?" He said, "Now." So, okay. So David went in and set up the mics for Garnet and Jim Morrison, the bass player, and Stan, of course. And Stan said, "I don't want to rehearse it." He said, "Just get a level and we'll roll tape." So I said, "Okay." And David gulped and said, "Okay." And we rolled tape. And out came The House of Orange. And what's on that record is that take. One take. And the secret of it all was really that Stan wrote songs totally in his head. I mean, he would not noodle on the guitar or play around with pen and paper. He'd write it totally in his head, had an incredible memory. So he'd been writing The House of Orange in his head for weeks, maybe months, maybe years, I don't know. And that night, when we were doing those keyboard overdubs, it was ready to come out on the page. And when he finished writing all the words out, it was ready to come out of his guitar. I mean, it was just ready. And it was an amazing experience to see that process go down the way it did. You know, the guy was a genius. I guess first and foremost, Stan was an expert observer of life. You know, he would, if you listen to his songs, a lot of them are sort of third-person narrative. And a lot of the material for the songs he would gather through talking to people. When he was on the road, you know, he'd go in for a beer and he'd sit down next to somebody who had a story to tell, and he'd listen to the story and soak it all up. And as I said earlier, he had a fantastic memory. And at some point or other, that story may come out in the form of a song. A great observer, a master of detail. You know, he could, like any good writer, any good novelist, poet, short story writer, songwriter, whatever, finally is better at observing detail than most of us normal mortals. And the song Lies comes to mind, with the verse in there about the farm wife pouring herself a cup of coffee and then she drips carnation from the can. And there's an exquisite detail that makes that song great. all of those lyrical details. So I think that was at the root of it. No matter where he went, he could observe and translate those observations directly into songs. He was aware of of what I think is true of most creative people. It's a lot harder to write about something that you're emotionally involved with, that you have an emotional investment in, than it is to write about something that you're the outside observer of. And in fact, a lot of his best songs, most of his best songs, are externalized. They're Stan, the writer, observing life that's going on in front of him. So yeah, he could write about, he didn't write about any part of the country that he hadn't seen firsthand. He wrote about all the places he had been, and he wrote about his impressions of those places, but God, they were accurate. And you talk to people from the West who listen to Feel Behind the Plow, and they say, right on. You know? In fact, he had a Western farmer come up to him after a concert one time, and he says, son, you're real good. You write about things I'm afraid to even think about.